The Praetorian Guard, Chapter 6, Meeting the Team. The first day of training had been deceptively simple. A few light sparring sessions, some target practice, and drills that felt almost routine. John had expected something more intense, but Sarah had told him it was just the beginning. That night, as he lay in his bed in the underground facility, he knew the real challenge was still ahead of him. And he was right. The next morning, John woke early, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation settle in his chest. After a quick shower, he dressed in his black jumpsuit and headed to the dining room for a quick breakfast. As he ate alone, his mind kept wandering back to the question that had been gnawing at him since his arrival. Who else was part of the shadows of the night? Surely he wasn't the only new recruit. Sarah was training. After breakfast, John made his way to the training room. The hallways were quiet, the cold metallic walls absorbing the faint hum of machinery that filled the facility. When he reached the large reinforced doors, he took a deep breath before stepping inside. The room looked different today, less sterile and more lived in. The training modules that had seemed intimidating yesterday now felt like part of his new routine. But what caught his attention were the 4 figures already waiting inside. As John entered the room, they all turned to face him. He paused for a moment, taking them in. These were his teammates, his new family in the shadows of the night. He felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He had spent weeks training alone, but now, everything was about to change. Sarah stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the interaction closely, but she didn't say anything yet. Instead, one of the 4 stepped forward. He was tall, easily a few inches taller than John, with broad shoulders, blonde hair, and striking blue eyes. There was something about his confident stride and the glint in his eye that screamed trouble. He wore a wide grin as he walked up to John and offered his hand.
"Mark,"
he said, his voice loud and full of energy.
"I'm the weapons specialist around here. Guns, knives, explosives, you name it, I've mastered it. And now, you get the privilege of learning everything I know."
He winked, his grin widening as if he'd just told a joke only he found funny. John couldn't help but smile back, shaking Mark's hand. There was a kind of wildness about him, a spark of recklessness that reminded John of the soldiers back at the academy who were always looking for a thrill. He could tell that working with Mark was going to be interesting.
"Looking forward to it,"
John said, trying to match Mark's energy.
"Damn right you are,"
Mark replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement.
"Stick with me, and you'll be shooting targets before they even know they're in your sights."
Before John could respond, another figure stepped forward, this one much quieter.
"Son,"
he said, his voice low and measured. He was shorter than John, with sharp Asian features and a focused intensity in his eyes. His movements were precise, almost methodical, as though every action was calculated.
"Explosives specialist."
Son's handshake was firm but quick, and he immediately stepped back, as though he preferred to stay in the background. John got the sense that Son was someone who didn't waste words, a man of few but carefully chosen actions. There was a quiet strength about him, the kind that didn't need to be shown off.
"Good to meet you,"
John said, nodding. Son simply nodded back, his face impassive. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Approval, maybe. John wasn't sure, but he could tell Son would be someone he could rely on in the heat of a mission. The next person to approach had a more imposing presence. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark eyes, his features sharp and stern. His skin was tanned, and John could tell from the way he carried himself that he was someone who had seen his share of conflict.
"Salah,"
he said, his voice deep and steady.
"Counterintelligence specialist."
Salah's handshake was brief, but there was a sense of gravitas to it, as though each movement carried the weight of his experience. He had the air of someone who had been through the worst and came out stronger on the other side. His expression was stoic, and John could tell that Salah was someone who kept his emotions tightly controlled.
"I'll teach you how to see through lies, gather intelligence, and manipulate the enemy,"
Salah continued.
"But understand this, trust is earned, not given."
John nodded, appreciating the directness.
Understood.
And then, the last member of the team stepped forward. She was smaller than the others, with short, dark hair and sharp European features. What immediately caught John's attention, though, was her smile. It was bright and friendly, almost out of place in such a serious setting. She extended her hand with a warm grin.
Marta,
she said, her voice light but confident.
I'm a cybernetic specialist. If it's digital, I can hack it. If it's got wires, I can fix it. And if it's got gears, well, let's just say, I can make it do things it's not supposed to.
John shook her hand, feeling slightly disarmed by her casual demeanor. She was so different from the others. Where they were intense, calculated, or stoic, she seemed cheerful, almost playful. But John knew better than to be fooled by appearances. Anyone in the shadows of the night had earned their place, and if Marta was part of this team, it was for a good reason.
I hope you're ready to learn,
Marta added, her eyes twinkling.
Because with me, you'll need to keep up. I'll try,
John replied, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. She hadn't introduced herself yet, but John already knew what her specialty was. He had seen it in the way she moved, the way she commanded the room with a quiet authority.
And I'll be teaching you hand-to-hand combat,
she said, her voice steady.
It's not just about strength, John. It's about precision, speed, understanding your opponent, and making sure they never get the upper hand. You'll learn from all of us, but if you don't master the basics of close combat, you won't last long in the field.
John nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about becoming the best version of himself, faster, stronger, and smarter than he had ever been before. And now he had a team to back him up. Over the next month, John threw himself into the training. Each day was filled with grueling drills, each designed to push him to his limits in ways he hadn't thought possible. He spent hours learning about weapons from Mark, everything from standard-issue rifles to more exotic, specialized gear that the Dominion kept under wraps. Mark's enthusiasm for all things destructive was infectious, and John found himself absorbing knowledge faster than he expected. With Sun, John learned the delicate art of explosive. Sun was quiet but meticulous, teaching him not just how to set charges, but how to disarm them, and how to understand the science behind the explosion. Every lesson was a test in patience and precision. Salah, true to his stoic nature, taught John the subtleties of counterintelligence. It wasn't just about gathering information. It was about reading people, understanding motivations, and knowing when to manipulate, when to press, and when to back off. John learned quickly that Salah's lessons were more mental than physical, but no less exhausting. Marta, always smiling, taught John how to navigate the digital landscape. Hacking, cybersecurity, drone operations, she made it all seem so effortless. But behind her easygoing nature, John realized just how dangerous she could be. With a few keystrokes, Marta could turn the tide of any mission, and John had to keep up with her rapid-fire lessons. And then there was Sarah. Every morning, she drilled him relentlessly in hand-to-hand combat. Her movements were fluid and precise, every punch and kick delivered with deadly accuracy. John struggled to keep up at first, but under her tutelage, he began to understand the rhythm of the fight. She pushed him harder than anyone, never giving him an inch, and by the end of each session, his body ached in ways he didn't think possible. As the days passed, John realized something important. Even though each of them had their specialties, they all knew how to do everything. They were more than just a team of specialists. They were each capable of handling any situation, no matter how dangerous or unpredictable. And now, John had to learn from them. Every lesson, every drill, was a step toward becoming a full-fledged member of the Shadows of the Night. The month that followed was a whirlwind of training, each day a new trial that pushed John further than he had ever thought possible. He learned not only how to survive in the shadows, but how to thrive. The team around him, their skills, their experience, became his foundation. But now, after weeks of drills and lessons, it was time for the real test. It was early morning when John woke, his body already accustomed to the strict routine. The once foreign enhancements in his body had become second nature. His reflexes were sharper, his senses heightened, and his movements fluid. He had spent weeks sparring with Sarah in close-quarters combat, working alongside Mark in mastering weapons and learning how to disarm explosives with Sun. Marta had shown him how to manipulate systems and drones with surgical precision, while Salah drilled into him the intricacies of reading people, gathering intel, and staying 3 steps ahead of any opponent. As John got dressed, putting on his black jumpsuit, he could feel the weight of the day ahead. This wasn't just another training exercise. Today, they had something more dangerous in store. After a quick shower and a bite to eat, John made his way to the training room. The rest of the team was already gathered there, waiting. Mark leaned casually against a wall, grinning as always, his energy radiating even in the quiet moments. Sun sat on a bench, calmly adjusting a piece of equipment. Salia stood by the far end, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room as if he were always looking for hidden threats. Marta, cheerful as ever, was tapping away at a small tablet, no doubt preparing for whatever tech-heavy challenge awaited them today. And Sarah, of course, stood at the front of the room, her expression serious as always, ready to lead them into the fire. John stepped in, and the team turned toward him, the air thick with anticipation.
"Good morning, John,"
Sarah said, her tone neutral, but there was an intensity in her gaze.
"Today is different."
John nodded, his body already tensing in response. He knew she was about to push him harder than before. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just about testing his skills. It was about seeing if he could hold up when things got truly dangerous.
"Today, you'll be working as part of the team,"
Sarah continued.
"The drills are over. We're moving to live exercises. You've learned a lot in the past few weeks, but now we need to see if you can handle the pressure when it counts."
John's heart quickened. Live exercises meant real danger, real consequences. He knew the team wouldn't put him in a situation he couldn't handle, but the stakes had just been raised. He'd been prepared for this, but that didn't make the coming trial any easier.
"Clear."
Mark grinned as he stepped forward, clapping John on the shoulder.
"Don't worry, John boy. You'll be fine. Just remember everything I taught you about shooting and try not to blow up on your first day."
His tone was light, but John could see the flicker of seriousness in his eyes. This was a test not just for John, but for the team. Sun stood up, adjusting the straps on his tactical vest.
"We'll be using live explosives today. Stay sharp and stay focused. I won't let you get hurt, but you need to follow my lead when it comes to disarmament. Everything you do today has a ripple effect,"
Salah said, his voice calm but firm.
"Every move you make impacts the team. Stay vigilant and don't underestimate your opponents."
John nodded, taking it all in. His team had his back, but this wasn't just about surviving the exercise. It was about proving himself. He had come a long way, but now he had to show them that he belonged, that he could operate in the shadows alongside them. Marta, always smiling, walked over to him, holding up her tablet.
"I've already set up some surprises for you in the system, John. Think of it as a digital maze. Your task is to navigate it without tripping over any wires. Think you're ready?"
John gave her a small grin.
"I've had a good teacher."
She winked at him and stepped back.
"Let's hope you remember the lessons."
Sarah motioned for the group to gather around.
"We've set up a scenario in the training complex. It's a simulated mission, but it's as close to real as we can make it. Hostages, armed combatants, explosives, and time pressure. John, you'll be acting as a member of the team, and the decisions you make will affect the outcome of the exercise."
John felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. This was no ordinary drill. It was a mission. A glimpse of what the real world would be like once he and the team were deployed on actual operations.
"The goal,"
Sarah continued,
"is to secure the hostages and eliminate the threat. The building is rigged with traps, and the enemy will respond to your movements. This is about coordination, strategy, and execution. You've learned enough to get through this, but only if you work as part of the team."
She paused, her eyes locking onto Joe.
Remember, in the shadows, you're only as strong as the people next to you. Trust your team. Trust yourself.
John nodded, his body humming with adrenaline. He wasn't just being tested on his own skills. He was being tested on his ability to operate within the team. He would need to rely on them just as much as they would rely on him. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts.
Let's begin.
The team geared up, strapping on their tactical vests and checking their weapons. John followed their lead, the weight of the gun in his hand feeling natural now after weeks of training with Mark. His senses were sharp, every sound, every movement in the room amplified by his implants. He could feel the tension building as they prepared for the exercise, but there was also a quiet confidence in the air. This was what they had trained for. The doors to the training complex opened, revealing a dimly lit corridor ahead. The space beyond looked like an abandoned industrial facility. Narrow hallways, rusted metal beams, and flickering lights. The sound of distant machinery echoed through the walls, adding to the sense of unease. Somewhere in there, hostages were waiting to be rescued. And somewhere, enemies were waiting to strike. Sarah moved to the front, signaling for the team to follow. They entered the complex in formation, each member falling into their assigned roles with practiced ease. John was in the middle of the group, his senses on high alert, his heart pounding as he scanned the surroundings. Mark was on point, his weapon raised as he checked each corner with quick, efficient movements. Salah followed close behind, his eyes scanning for any signs of surveillance or traps. Sun brought up the rear, his hands already adjusting the detonators and disarmament tools he carried. Marta moved in near Silence, her tablet in hand as she worked to disable security systems and scramble communications. They moved as one, each step calculated, each breath measured. As they reached the first intersection, Mark raised a fist, signaling a halt. He gestured to John.
Your turn, John boy. Hostiles ahead. You take point.
John's pulse quickened, but he nodded, stepping forward. He knew this moment would come. He'd have to take charge, make the calls. He moved to the front, raising his weapon as he crept down the corridor, every muscle tense, every sense heightened. His new implants hummed in the background, amplifying his reflexes, sharpening his perception. The corridor twisted ahead, and as John rounded the corner, he spotted them, two armed figures standing guard near a door. John crouched, signaling for the team to hold back. He calculated his next move quickly. Taking out the guards quietly would ensure they didn't trigger any alarms. He aimed, breathing steady, and fired 2 quick shots, the suppressor on his gun ensuring the sound was little more than a whisper. The guards dropped without a sound. John glanced back at the team, receiving approving nods from Mark and Salah. His confidence, John pushed the door open, revealing a larger room beyond, hostages, tied and bound, their eyes wide with fear. But across the room, a group of hostiles stood waiting, weapons drawn. Sarah's voice rang out, calm but commanding.
Time to see what you've learned, John.
The fight was on. The room erupted into chaos the moment John pushed through the door. The hostiles had been waiting, their weapons already trained on the hostages. In the split second it took for John to register the scene, the enemy raised their rifles, ready to fire. Instinct kicked in. John dove for cover behind a large steel crate, his movements faster and more precise than they had ever been. His enhanced reflexes took over, his body reacting almost before his mind could process the danger. Bullets whizzed past him, ricocheting off the walls with a sharp metallic ring. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he glanced back at the team. Sarah, always calm in the heat of battle, signaled to the others with a quick, decisive gesture. In an instant, they spread out, each member moving with fluid precision. Mark slid into position beside John, his rifle ready, a wide grin plastered across his face, as though he lived for moments like this.
Well, John boy,
he muttered.
Welcome to the show.
John smirked despite the tension. He peeked around the edge of the crate, assessing the situation. The hostages, 4 civilians bound to chairs, fear etched across their faces, sat in the center of the room. 6 hostiles stood around them, guns drawn and shouting commands in a language John didn't recognize. 2 more guards were stationed near the exits, scanning the room for any sign of the team. John whispered into his comms.
Any chance of disarming whatever they've rigged on the hostages? On it.
Sun's calm voice came through.
Just need a distraction.
John turned to Mark, who was already itching for action.
I'll draw their fire,
John said.
You take out the guards near the door. We need those exits clear.
Mark gave him a wild grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement.
You got it, John boy.
John took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was his first real test. Live fire, real enemies, real stakes. He had trained for weeks, pushing his body and mind to the limit, but this was different. If he made a mistake here, people would die. But he wouldn't fail. John surged out from behind the crate, sprinting across the open space to the next piece of cover. As he moved, the hostiles opened fire, their attention now focused on him. He could feel the heat of the bullets as they zipped past him, but his enhanced reflexes made his movements almost effortless. His mind processed the danger in real time, calculating the angle of each shot and the distance to his next target. He slid into cover behind a large metal beam, firing off 2 quick shots as he went. One of the hostiles dropped, the shot clean and precise. The other enemies shouted in panic, realizing they were under attack from all sides. Mark, as promised, took out the guards near the doors with swift, well-placed shots. The exits were clear now, but the real danger still lay ahead. John glanced over at Sun, who was moving with silent precision, inching his way toward the hostages while the rest of the team kept the enemy distracted. Salah was already at work, his eyes scanning the room, analyzing the hostiles' movements. He called out orders over the comms, directing the team with the cool efficiency of a man who had been in too many firefights to count.
John, flank right. Take out the 2 near the control console. Sarah, get in close. Disable their leader.
John followed the instructions without hesitation. He moved right, staying low as he advanced on the 2 hostiles guarding the console. They were distracted, trying to track the source of the gunfire, their eyes darting from one corner of the room to the other. John didn't give them a chance to react. He fired twice, 2 headshots, clean and quick. The hostiles crumpled to the ground. Across the room, Sarah moved with deadly precision, her figure almost a blur as she closed in on the leader of the group. John watched, momentarily stunned by her speed and grace. Sarah didn't even bother with her gun. In one swift motion, she disarmed the leader, twisting the weapon from his grip and knocking him unconscious with a single strike to the temple. John blinked, realizing that even with his enhancements, he still had a long way to go to match her.
Hostiles neutralize.
Salah's voice cut through the comms.
Sun. Status on the hostages.
Sun was already at the center of the room, crouched over the hostages, his hands moving deftly as he worked to disarm the explosives rigged beneath their chairs. His calm demeanor never wavered, even as the clock ticked down.
Almost done,
Sun replied, his voice as steady as ever.
Just keep the area clear.
John and Mark stood guard as Sun worked. Marta, stationed near the entrance, was busy disabling any external alarms or traps the hostiles might have left behind. Her fingers flew across her tablet, her face serious and focused. After what felt like an eternity, Sun let out a small breath.
Disarmed. Hostages are secure.
The tension in the room began to ease as the last threat was neutralized. John felt his muscles relax slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His heart was racing, but the mission was a success. His first live exercise with the team, and they had completed it without a hitch. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room with a critical gaze. She nodded to the team.
Good work. Hostages secure. All targets eliminated. Efficient and clean. Exactly what I expected from you.
Her eyes locked onto John, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was a glint of approval in her expression.
Not bad for your first run, John.
John felt a surge of pride, but kept his expression neutral.
Thanks, but,
she continued, her tone sharpening,
this was just the beginning. That was a simulation, a controlled environment. In the field, things won't go this smoothly. You won't always have time to plan. There will be chaos, and you'll need to adapt.
She paused, her gaze intense.
We're not like the others, John. The shadows of the night don't have backup. We don't call for reinforcements. It's just us. And if we fail, no one will know. There's no glory in this job, only survival. Remember that.
John nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't about winning medals or earning recognition. This was about life and death, operating in the darkest corners of the Dominion where failure meant disappearing into the void without a trace. Sarah motioned for the team to regroup.
Take 5. We debrief in the next room.
The rest of the team began to gather their gear, but John stood for a moment longer, staring at the room where the simulated hostages had been. It felt so real, the fear in their eyes, the adrenaline of the fight. If it had been a real mission, would they have survived? Would he have made the right calls? He shook off the thought and turned to follow the team. He knew there was no point in second-guessing himself. He had survived his first test, and that was enough for today. As he walked out of the room, he couldn't help but feel that, despite the victory, the real challenges were still ahead of him.